pleasure to welcome David Carballo, who is Assistant Provost for General Education, Associate Professor of Archaeology, Anthropology, and Latin American Studies at Boston University. He's an expert in the archaeology of Mesoamerica, especially central Mexico, where he currently leads the Proyecto Arqueológico Tlahinga, an excavation of an apartment compound at the ancient city of Teotihuacan. And he's also part of the Proyecto Plaza de las Columnas at the same site. So he's thinking both about household archaeology and elite archaeology in the center of the city of Teotihuacan. His books include Obsidian in the Teotihuacan State, Weaponry and Ritual Production at the Moon Pyramid, Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central Mexico, the co-edited Dump and Oaks volume, Teotihuacan, The World Beyond the City, as well as co-edited volumes on the symbolic dimensions of obsidian in Mesoamerica, and on collaborative and collective action from archaeological perspectives. His most recent book is A Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain. I've just found out that it's a book that is being used in courses at our very own university, and very rightly so. And he'll be talking to us about that book today. So it's my very great pleasure to turn things over to David. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Claudia. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation and to your support and Natalie's as well, and everyone else involved with the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm going to start sharing screen over here, and it's what you just saw, the cover of the book. And I wanted to just start off really briefly on the cover itself. This is a mural from the Presidencia Municipal in Tlaxcala. Those of you who know parts of this story know how key the Tlaxcalteca were as native allies to Cortés and the Spaniards. They were the major rivals of the Mexica Aztecs and the Triple Alliance Empire. Although they were ethnically very similar, Nahuatl speakers also said that they came from Aztlan. They were politically independent and resisting incorporation by the empire. So this particular mural within the Presidencia, which is like the city hall for Tlaxcala, was done by the artist Desiderio Hernandez Xochitiotzin. And there are murals in various rooms of the Presidencia that recount pre-Hispanic history, early colonial period into the Republican era. And in fact, they were not this exact scene, but they were on the license plates for the state pretty recently. But this scene captures the strategic alliance between the Tlaxcalteca, and in particular, the elder, one of the leaders, Xicontecat, the elder, with Cortés and the Spaniards, and of course, Doña Marina or Malintzli or Malinche as the translator, the key translator of the encounter in the center. And so this was a mural that I was eager to use and received permission from the artist's foundation run by his family. So what drew me to this story, I think, started with some of my earliest interest in archaeology as an undergraduate in the mid 90s when these two books came out. And so this was around the time of another quincentennial. So we're now at the quincentennial of what we could call the Spanish-Mexica War of 1519 to 1521. And that was part of the impetus for doing this particular book project. But there were, of course, these events had been recounted since Cortés started writing his own letters back to King Carlos I of Spain as the events were unfolding. And then after that, historians have recounted the events since the 16th century onward. And so it's mostly been through the engagement of texts and in some cases through image or art history, less so archaeology, although there is archaeology relevant to the period, less so sort of the framing that I set out to do in this book of having a deep history approach where the transatlantic antecedents on both sides of the ocean on Mesoamerican and Iberia were covered in a chapter for each case. And some of that framing comes from Carlos Fuentes's book on the quincentennial of Columbus, in 1992. This book here, The Buried Mirror, where he's looking at deep entanglements on both sides of the Atlantic, and names it this book. Of course, here you see Velázquez's famous Golden Age painting, but also talking about the obsidian mirrors to Tezcatlipoca, the Aztec deity that had been buried in under altars and were venerated by Mesoamericans, but actually also of interest to Europeans and Philip II of Spain and other European elites had access to some of these mirrors. So that was some of my initial interests as I was first getting into archaeology back in the 90s. And then as I started becoming more involved, especially with the archaeology of Tlaxcala, then incorporating primary documents, and especially those that have native voices in them. And one really key document for understanding Tlaxcala as I was starting in the archaeology of that state around 20 years ago is the book by Diego Muñoz Camargo on his history of Tlaxcala. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. But then, of course, Miguel León Portilla's compilation of the Florentine Codex Book 12 and other relevant documents that provide a Nahua perspective on this encounter. So taking an archaeological perspective, though, of course, engages texts. It's some of the key lines of evidence that we have for this, but also one that thinks and prioritizes the physical world and the physical world of landscapes and sites and palimpsest history that you see in places like these two sites, which I start out framing in the first chapter, because they're ones that have very intense links of the sort of fraught history of Cortés, who is from Medellin in Extremadura, Spain, that you see on top left, leading a massacre of unarmed Cholulteca in Cholula, Mexico. But then also just the centuries or millennia of occupation that's represented by these sites, and you can just see visually in architecture of these prominent hills that tether the two sites. So there's the landscape side, the architectural side, and then artifacts and imagery that are from this period that relate to these linkages. So things like ceramics and the famous Talavera or Mayolica pottery that was then produced around Cholula. From antecedents in the Aztec period and long traditions of potting, especially in southern Puebla. Of course, the version of Guadalupe of Extremadura, and then her apparition at Tepeyac in Mexico City in a place of previous Aztec feminine divinity. So looking at this as a sequence of millennial long history and long periods of cultural adaptation and change, really starting looking at Iberia from first agriculturalists or even earlier into the Paleolithic period and taking it up to the 15th century. I use this quote in the epigraph to this particular chapter of thinking about Spain or Iberia itself as having been a crossroads for many different civilizations, waves of invasions, some of them somewhat more benign, like colonizations of the Phoenicians, who of course came from the Eastern Mediterranean and established centers in the south of Spain. And then even so, that particular petroglyph that you see from Santa Maria de Olla is in Galicia, up on the Atlantic coast. And so this creation of a hinge, like the Iberian Peninsula as a hinge that connected the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds, and had a key role in receiving influences and influencing both worlds. The Phoenicians, of course, established colonies in southern Spain, most famously in what today is Cadiz, formerly Phoenician Gadir, and that connected southern Iberians to this wider Mediterranean interaction sphere. They also founded Carthage, and the Carthaginians later invaded southern Iberia. And then the Romans in the Punic War took the peninsula from the Carthaginians and slowly crept northward in conquests that took some 2 centuries. And this particular site that you see here, called Las Medulas in northwestern Spain, looks like this beautiful landscape from the American Southwest, like these cliffs and hoodoos and things like that. But it is completely an anthropogenic landscape. It's the result of the Romans doing hydraulic fracking of these cliffs for their gold deposits. And indeed, Las Medulas became the richest gold mine in the Roman Empire for a couple centuries. So that history of colonization of Iberia, of mineral extraction as well, going back deep in time and seeing some of the later legacies in what would become the colonization of the Americas. So here again is Cortés's hometown of Medellin. It's in Extremadura. It's not a place that most would visit unless you're really interested in Cortés. The bigger town nearby is Mérida, which was a very important Roman city, Augusta Emerita, and of course is the namesake of the largest city in the Yucatan Peninsula, Mérida. But here in Medellin, you can see just on this prominent hill overlooking the Guadiana River, the deep history of occupation. It actually starts before the Romans. There's the Tartessian period, which is a cultural sphere that interacted with the Phoenicians and had ties through into the Greek world and Eastern Mediterranean. Then you have this Roman theater built on the hillside and other Roman vestiges. And you have medieval history, of course, and both Islamic. In the top of the hill are some Islamic water cisterns, and then this church to San Martin. And this is, in fact, where Cortés himself was baptized, and the church is directly overlaying a Roman temple to Pluto. So that clear link to millennia history in the area. The Romans, of course, created a network of cities and roads that pretty much mirrors the map of Spain today, with the notable exception of Madrid, which was a Islamic fort. But all these other major cities on the peninsula were major Roman settlements, and many of the highways or train routes mimic the Roman system. So there's that legacy to earlier urbanism. And then in the period of the medieval period and the wars between Christians and Muslims, known by the conquistadors as the Reconquista, there's many of the key social institutions that would be salient in the colonization of the Americas resulted through these centuries-long conflicts. And that includes the militarization of the patron saint, Santiago, Saint James, who before, in the earlier medieval period, was a mendicant apostle, not particular bellicose like you see over here, but who became the Moor slayer, Santiago Matamoros, and who in the Americas would become Santiago Mataindios, so the militarization of a patron saint. And then some of the social and political institutions, like the adelantado. To have the title of adelantado during the Reconquista period means you are authorized for military action on the frontier areas like Extremadura. And the encomiendas were land arrangements of conquered populations. And these, of course, would then be key in the colonization first of the Canary Islands, and then across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, and eventually into Mesoamerica. The same sort of history. So many accounts of the conquest or Spanish-Aztec War begin by framing some of that deeper history in Spain. They often go back into the Reconquista period, in particular, as some of the ideological templates in the minds of conquistadors. Less so do you tend to see the same sort of treatment of Mesoamerica as having had a deep history and one whose people drew on historical memory in framing their own presence. But we can do that in a similar way. We might not have the same sort of resolution of texts, but you really can see it in material culture. So just looking at Cholula and its Great Pyramid, by some accounts, the largest in volume in all of the world. It was built over some 700 years in the first millennium, but there are earlier occupations going to the formative period, the first millennium BCE. So not so different than what we just saw in Medellin in Spain. In terms of conquest history, the massacre at Cholula is probably what has gotten the most attention that you see over to left. But also just the layers of history of this site itself, especially its pyramid, which you can see on that colonial period map at the top, the Tlachihualtepet, which in Nahuatl means the human-made mountain. This particular monument had fallen into disuse after in the later first millennium Common Era, which we would call the Epiclassic period in central Mexico. And there's a slight disoccupation or contraction of the population until the post-classic Choluteca, who were the ancestors of the people that Cortés encountered. And they had created a new temple where you see that church in the colonial period map. That was a very large temple and pilgrimage site to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And so Cholula then was revitalized as a market and pilgrimage center in the Aztec period. Now that pyramid, having been active when Cortés conquered the city, then was razed to the ground, and its stones used to build that particular monastery and church to San Gabriel that now anchors the colonial and modern city. So some of my interest then are having worked in central Mexico on different time periods and really having an interest in seeing what we know of the 16th century. Our best sources, of course, come from the early colonial period, when we have very rich texts from colonial New Spain and what we know of Aztec religion and ritual practices from that period. To the earlier context that I've mostly worked on, which includes the formative period of the, say, first millennium BCE and the classic period at Teotihuacan of the first half of the first millennium CE, and some of these similarities in types of deities and really key imagery and contexts of ritual practice. So, for instance, when you look at the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan itself, and here I'm drawing mostly on the work of Leonardo Lopez Lujan, who's the director of the Templo Mayor project, but along with some other colleagues, like, for instance, Javier Urcid, who's worked on Mexica writing. We have artifacts documenting much of the sequence of complex societies in Mesoamerica, like, for instance, that Olmec mask going back to the early formative period. But then you have some very purposeful archaisms that the Mexica built into this sacred environment, drawing on the precursor Toltec civilizations, and here using Toltec broadly as in the way that the Mexica did, to also include Teotihuacan. So we have, this Teotihuacan style shrine to the southeast. We have this Tula style bench to the north in the House of the Eagles. We have writing of intermediate between those two civilizations of another city-state to the south known as Xochicalco that the Mexica really seem to have actively emulated in creating their own writing system. And so I like to, for students, make an analogy here to the mall in Washington, D.C., where, of course, we have this Egyptian obelisk and Greek-style temples and Roman eagles and other imagery that's drawing on a historical memory of Eurasian civilizations as part of the political legitimacy of a present capital. And the Mexica, of course, did the same. And often we're ignoring that sort of purposeful use of archaisms and historical memory in framing indigenous presence. So that's the first half of the book deals with those sorts of deep centuries and millennia long history and transatlantic perspective. And the book, being an archaeologist, emphasizes the material world and landscapes and artifacts and sites. and then leading to the colonial period and the sorts of mutual accommodations of these two different culture regions coming into contact. And so the sort of pivot chapter is in the middle of the book, comparing particularly Castilian Spanish society and Mexica Aztec society of the 15th and into early 16th centuries. Some similarities that we could point to in having conquering patron deities, so Huitzilopochtli for the Mexica and Santiago Matamoros for the Castilians. Some similarities in urban and economic organization and in narratives of ethnogenesis and imperial foundations, but also, of course, many differences. And some treatments really emphasize those differences, or in many cases, there are differences in technology or in disease. And I do talk about those as well, but I'm a little more interested in framing the similarities and differences in things like social institutions and belief systems of what people had as templates for their own actions at the time. And so some differences structurally, of course, could include the very direct control mechanisms of the Spanish Empire, drawing on its and looking very consciously to its Roman antecedents and portraying itself as a sort of a new form of Roman Empire, versus the very indirect or hegemonic control techniques of Mesoamerican empires, including the Aztec Triple Alliance, or differences in religion, like Castilian Christianity of the 16th century being very absolutist, versus the Mexica religion being much more incorporative and just adding deities of conquered people to their pantheon. This, of course, these historical memory and ways of knowing were perpetuated through socialization and education. And so another part of this is framing the different educational systems on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, of course, again, a lot of attention has gone to the Spanish systems, especially on the right. You see an image of the University of Salamanca, such a key old institution, and there are some fascinating comparisons that can be made of the sort of education that the conquistador class, people like Hernán Cortés, received in Salamanca as they were trying to become bureaucrats, essentially, or letrados, men of letters, by reading up on legal codes and sort of this very professional and functional type education, versus what the priestly class through theology got. And this includes people like Bernardino de Sahagún, the Franciscan chronicler, and other chroniclers who are more sympathetic and wanted to fight for indigenous rights in the New World, were receiving a very different education, much more humanistic and nuanced philosophical understanding. And it's really interesting to see how that particular grounding in this base of education impacted those two populations differently. Now, it's not, it gets to the individual level. There were other friars like Sepulveda who argued the case against Las Casas. They were both trained in Salamanca, so people could use the same sorts of sources in marshaling different arguments. But there is some interesting differences in the sort of more professional training or the more humanistic training at Salamanca. But I also want to highlight that Mesoamericans had their own educational systems and their own pedagogies, and we could see that in the color plates. I use these two images so to somewhat juxtapose this Maya Scribal Center at Chiltún. This image was done by Heather Hurst, or also the Calmecac and Telpochcali system of the Mexica. So those were ways that people marshaled historical memory and precedent in framing this encounter. And the encounter, of course, lasted years, and we often pinpoint it to a shorter interval, but it was a more protracted process. It started with early explorations by Cordoba and Grijalva, who were sent by Diego de Velázquez, who was the adelantado and governor in Cuba, who was authorized for some sort of military incursions, but he was not authorizing Cordoba or Grijalva to do that, and nor did he authorize Cortés for military invasions. So because of that, Cortés's invasion was legally illegitimate along those grounds, and it was part of his impetus for writing letters back to the King of Spain to try to justify this breach of command. And in the middle of this route, we find the buffer area between the Nahuatl and Mayan speaking worlds, and this, of course, is where the woman who was baptized as, or christened, I should say, as Doña Marina, and is known to us either as Malintli or Malinche, having a foot in these two worlds, was able to mediate linguistically some of this encounter, and went with the Spaniards to Veracruz, and then eventually inland towards the core of the Aztec Empire. So now here there are a number of projects done by colleagues who that are very relevant to new perspectives on this particular encounter. And so here is an image of the work of Roberto Junco and his team of underwater archaeologists who've been working off the coast of Villarrica de Veracruz, just north of the contemporary city of Veracruz, where Cortés had his ship scuttled. Now, one of the famous myths of these events is that Cortés burnt his boats, and this is taken on like popular in popular imagination as like a Caesar crossing the Rubicon type moment where Cortés was saying, "There's no turning back, we're burning the boats." This, of course, wasn't done. He had the boats scuttled because they weren't seaworthy anymore, but he removed all of the rigging and masts and everything that would be of use for being able to build new boats, and he had a carpenter with him. And so this was part of the way that they refashioned boats, smaller boats, brigantines, to then launch on the lakes of the Basin of Mexico in the final siege of Tenochtitlan. But here, Junco and team have found some amazing things, including 3 anchors, and there were 3 boats of this original expedition, and one of them still had adhering wood to it. And the wood can be identified as a species from the Cantabria region of Spain, and it's radiocarbon dated into the late 15th, early 16th century. So it seems to match precisely what one would hope for or expect for recovering some remains of this original fleet. And there are the 3 anchors were spaced apart in the harbor, consistent with 3 boats having been scuttled in place there. So in Veracruz, the Spaniards made an alliance with Totonacs, an indigenous group from that region, and some Totonacs came as porters and scouts with the expedition as they marched inland. Now, here is the region that I've worked in most, or of relevance to this particular encounter. And so here we're looking at northern Tlaxcala, and so this was the entry point where the Totonac scouts told Cortés that this is where you'll find some enemies of the Aztec Empire, and people who could potentially make an alliance or join forces. So there's some debate of where exactly a first battle occurred between the Spaniards and the few Totonacs that were with them after leaving a town called Ixtacamachtitlan, which is in the Sierra de Puebla. And it's called Tekoake or Tecoatzingo in the primary sources. When you count out the leagues that Cortés and Bernal Diaz and others are recounting, it doesn't make sense for it to have been, there is a Tekoake, there's a contemporary Tekoake that's outside of a town named Huamantla that you see crossed out on this map. And so I'm supporting this as the entry point, this more northerly settlement. And this is around where an area that we've worked in, but on earlier periods. And so here you can see on the bottom right from the Lienzo de Tlaxcala colonial period document, this entry point where you can see Marina and Cortés and some Tlaxcalteca who in this particular area were ethnic Otomís. It was hard to say if these were Nahuatl or Otomí speaking Tlaxcalteca, but providing food. So the landscape of entry would have looked something like this. And it probably would have been more intelligible to people from Castile, although with much higher volcanoes, but as this semi-arid high plains compared to the hot, humid coastal lowlands of the Maya region and Veracruz. Now, we've been working mostly on the formative period of this area, but just like anywhere in central Mexico, there's post-classic occupation just about everywhere, including in the site that we were working at here, La Laguna, which we think was a satellite on the outskirts of Tekoake. And there we have this Laura Heath Stout is my former student who analyzed these deposits. There's some pottery that connects to the northeast, like into east to Tenochtitlan and going the opposite way on that same route of entry. But then most of it works very well within the post-classic Mesoamerican world system and forms of Aztec black on orange pottery that show that these people who are ethnic Otomís, again, on this sort of buffer zone, not incorporated into the Aztec Empire, were nevertheless very much plugged in to this market economy and these sorts of pottery styles. So there was fighting at Tekoake, but then the group went farther south to a place called Tzompantepec or Tzompancingo. This is another place that we've worked, but again, primarily on the formative period, though having done reconnaissance into post-classic sites. And this particular town is one of the interesting things is seeing how these events are being commemorated 500 years later. Tzompantepec had its own symposium. It's a relatively small town, but looks to this history as really essential to the founding of the town. And here we do have a primary source accounts from Cortés and Bernal Diaz and others that there were multiple days, maybe up to 20 days, if you include Tekoake, of conflict, of fighting between the Spanish forces and the Tlaxcalteca. So this is interesting because in the 16th century documents, the Tlaxcalteca, of course, are presenting themselves as having always been loyal to the Spanish crown, that they basically welcome them with open arms. You saw that previous image where they're bringing them food, they're bringing them turkeys. But we have in some of the Spanish primary sources, and also this fantastic Otomí document. This is known as the Codex Huamantla or the Huamantla map, which is a very large screen. And this particular image is showing this fighting, the arrival of the Spaniards, and gruesome fighting, and also the presentation of gifts that would have been part of this initial encounter and the early hostilities between the Tlaxcalteca and the Spaniards before making that key alliance. Eventually, though, they did make an alliance, and that had consequences that you really can't underestimate for how the rest of the events unfolded. And so over here, we have a relatively recently created archaeological map for the city of Tlaxcala, or Tlaxcalan would be more appropriate for the time, done by Lane Farger and colleagues about 10 years ago. And in the colonial documents, again, Tlaxcalan is depicted as a confederation of 4 different city-states. But now we know, in actuality, archaeologically, it is one contiguous urban space with multiple terraces and plazas, and is very different from the layout of many other post-classic cities in lacking sort of a monumental core with large temples. It seems to have been a much more pluralistic city-state, and that was part of the strategy of the Tlaxcalteca for resisting incorporation into the empire. And indeed, the Tlaxcalteca, after the alliance with the Spaniards, continued as allies in invasions of other parts of Mesoamerica, and depicted themselves in the Lienzo de Tlaxcala and other documents as conquistadors in their own right. And you can see, like here, the native artists, the attention that they gave to the vestments and the arms of the Tlaxcalteca themselves, and being on the vanguard of these later wars of conquest. This particular one is from Panuco, I believe. But they continued up into the American Southwest, Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you go to the Adobe church there, you'll see a sign saying that this was founded with native allies from Tlaxcala. There probably were Tlaxcalteca who sailed across the Pacific and ended up in Guam, and as part of the Manila galleons that occurred later in the 16th century. So really key native actors in the construction of the colonial order of New Spain. After making the alliance in Tlaxcala and spending some time there, and then going south to Cholula, which included that massacre, the Spaniards and Tlaxcalteca crossed over the volcanoes between the two largest volcanoes in the basin of Mexico, which is now known as the Paso de Cortes today, and would have seen some site like this. This is, of course, a CGI reconstruction, but looking down at the twin city of Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco with its causeways and the dike that separated more brackish waters from fresh waters and other urban centers along the shoreline, and the evocation that we get from Bernal Diaz and other conquistadors that this was like what they knew from chivalric romances, like this book, Amadis of Gaul, which I remember when I took a Don Quixote seminar, the professor had us read this as an example of what Cervantes was satirizing, just to have a sense of what this genre was like. But this, of course, formed part of the template of the conquistador mindset on this journey and entering this city through the southern causeway that you see at the bottom there. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail of what's often framed as the main events of the actual war, but just some things that we can see through archaeology and material culture in different ways. Of course, the demographic toll on populations, that we can look at population estimates from the late Aztec period compared with the decades following the invasion. But the sort of extraction of mineral wealth, one example being this fantastic one, this bullion that you see in the bottom, which was melted down and was found in the 1980s near the Alameda Central in Mexico City. Now, those of you who know Mexico City know that that's where Calle Tacuba passes by, and that's where in earlier times, in Aztec times, the causeway connecting Tenochtitlan to the western lakeshore and the city of Tacuba, Tlacopan in the post-classic period, ran, and that this piece of bullion, probably, and Leonardo Lopez Luján has recently published on this, is from the Spaniards trying to sneak gold out in what's known as the Noche Triste, now recently reframed in Mexico as the Noche Victoriosa, when the Tenochca Mexica from Tenochtitlan expelled the Spaniards from the city along the Tacuba causeway. This other piece that you see on the left has stamps that had already been claimed and perhaps was going to be melted down itself, and just this gives you an indication of all the beautiful metalwork that we've lost because it was only appreciated for its potential value as coinage. Another place that has some recent archaeology relevant to these events is this site of Zultepec, Tekoake. And here, Enrique Martinez Vargas and Ana Maria Jarquin Pacheco have worked for now a couple decades. And what they've unearthed is the remains of a caravan that was captured by the inhabitants of Tekoake. And it's a multi-ethnic caravan that had Spaniards, Tainos, a few sub-Saharan Africans that were probably part of the chaos that ensued after the expulsion of the Spaniards and the Cortes group from Tenochtitlan, and who were captured, and some were sacrificed, and their heads were put on the skull rack in the town center of Tekoake. So another like clear archaeological indication of a point of resistance within this particular battle. Now, the end came from regrouping eventually in Tlaxcala, starting to construct those brigantines, both in Tlaxcala, and then launching them in Texcoco. So Texcoco was the second largest altepetl or city-state of the Triple Alliance, and then served as a port as when it broke away from that Triple Alliance and joined the Spaniards in Tlaxcalteca as allies. And then being able to use that as a port, Texcoco as a port to launch the brigantines, brought a new level of Eurasian total warfare that had evolved through the millennia of history that we saw earlier, especially like the Roman period and through the Reconquista, onto the lakes of the basin of Mexico, and sorts of fighting and absolute conquest and total war that was essentially unknown in Mesoamerica. Though it should be noted that the Mexica adapted to this. They eventually figured out this was a different type of fighting and fought very valiantly to protect their city. So part of that, for instance, is creating a siege, which was not a normal practice in Mesoamerican warfare. But as Cortés entered the city, it's clear that the wheels were spinning of how to lay siege to this island city, and part of that was cutting off the aqueducts and depriving it of fresh water. Eventually, of course, there is the surrender of the last great speaker, Cuauhtémoc, to Cortés in Tlatelolco on August 13th, 1521. And here you're looking again at palimpsest history, and one that's probably one of the most fraught and symbolic places in Latin America, because not only was there this surrender by the last Mexica ruler, but it was also where in 1968 there was a massacre of students protesting. And so this is Tlatelolco is a place that has had difficult history, but also shows the layers of Mexico. And this area is called the Plaza de las Tres Culturas because it shows the pre-Hispanic layers with the colonial Franciscan church. Just to the right of that, it would have been the Colegio de Santa Cruz, which is where Sahagún worked with his trilingual scribes on the Florentine Codex and recounting Aztec history, and then of course contemporary times and mestizo Mexico. So the final chapter ends with thinking about the hybridity and syncretism that characterized founding New Spain. I used in the subtitle the term forging New Spain as a little bit of a tip of the hat to Manuel Gamio, who was the Mexican archaeologist who brought stratigraphic excavation to the Americas and for-field anthropological thinking, and was really quite ahead of his time in many ways. He also, of course, was a product of his time. He wrote this book, Forjando Patria, after the Mexican Revolution, and thinking about how post-revolutionary Mexico could draw on its archaeology and history in framing a contemporary present that included, emphasizing mestizaje and learning Spanish over indigenous languages, but all the same, I mean, this was a very sort of explicit and purposeful way of drawing on historical memory of the country, and then that's part of the framing there. Outside of Teotihuacan is this wonderful aqueduct that's called the Padre Tembleque aqueduct that runs many, many miles and is a great version of or illustration of this hybridity. I mean, in some ways, it of course invokes a Roman aqueduct, but has a little Christian chapel in it, and it's clearly late medieval, early modern in that way, but then is also built with native techniques. So these were indigenous laborers who constructed it, and that includes adobe bricks and other things. So this perfect sort of fusion of ways of knowing and ways of doing. In religion, we see this, and many authors have covered the religious syncretism, but the decades that I've spent in Tlaxcala in particular got me interested in open air chapels like the one that you see over there, where, of course, when Peter of Ghent and other Franciscans came interested in converting native peoples, they needed to make accommodations to a different religious system, and that included holding mass outside, as was typical native practice for religion. It included making these large atriums with posa chapels, often laid out as like a quincunx, as the four directions in the center, which was a symbol very familiar to Mesoamericans. Another part of thinking through hybridity is the I think somewhat simple point that all human history is hybrid, and so these terms can sort of lose meaning. We tend to use it in colonial contexts, but if you look at the inside of that same church where you saw the Capilla Abierta in Tlaxcala, you look up at the ceiling, and it's Islamic. It's not, it's a mudéjar style like you would see in southern Spain and places like Seville. And so this, it's the introduction of hybrid elements that themselves are already hybrid. Of course, at the Tepeyac, the syncretism that you see in the sort of divinity of feminine divinity in this particular sacred spot north of the city, and it's sort of new apparition as the Virgin of Guadalupe. This particular image I loved. It was one that we also considered for the cover. It's attributed to the workshop of Jose Juarez in 1653, but it's called El Primer Milagro, the first miracle. And so this was the Virgin's healing of the man that you see shot by an arrow before him on September 26, 1531, which was this mock battle between the Toltec Mexica and Chichimex. Now, again, still framing that history of self as the Tolteca Chichimeca, the civilized and the barbaric, which was part of the way that the Mexica framed themselves in this early colonial period. But I also love that you can see on the top right that this is still a lake environment, and people are processing up the northern causeway to Tepeyac. Over in Spain, we can see similar types of things. This is the Palacio de Toledo Moctezuma, and it connects the nobility from Mexico. So this was the pairing of the conquistador Juan de Moctezuma Cano with Doña Isabel de Moctezuma, which was one of Moctezuma's daughters, and then marrying a Spanish noblewoman. And then they created this palace, and they framed their own lineages with reference to their deep history. And that includes, the Mexica emperors. You can see they have European style crowns both on their heads and in the crest that's on the outside of the structure for the Mexican line, and then the Roman emperors on the Spanish line. The same sort of conjuring of the deep history can be seen at the highest level with the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This was his marriage pavilion in Sevilla, and it has these great. Well, first it's a mudéjar style. You can see the Islamic influences in the particular fountain there, and then you have these Greco-Roman motifs, in particular these two pillars, which were important early because they come from Cadiz, or that Phoenician settlement, and they're known from the Greeks as the pillars of Heracles or Roman Hercules. But even before that, the Phoenician god Melkart, who was also like this divine wrestler, and the saying "non plus ultra," no further beyond, that's what comes out of the Greco-Roman myth, that this was the end of the world. Carlos reversed that and made his motto plus ultra, that they had gone further beyond. Likewise, this globe over here harkens to Isidore of Seville, the early medieval period Spanish priest who wrote this long history and also made this world map in this T form that's known as a TO map. But then what I also love is, there's the, the apex of power of this imperial order. But then we also have people like Diego Muñoz Camargo, who in his history of Tlaxcala is showing his competence in this same deep history. He's drawing on the Mediterranean deep history of Hercules, who placed his columns, that there'd be no more plus ultra. So he's very conscientiously drawing on this history to then depict the founding and the colonial history, the pre-Hispanic and colonial history of his own lands of Tlaxcala, which he then wrote and took on a boat across the Atlantic to present to Philip II, who is then the King of Spain. So that's some of the resonances in the colonial period, and I consider to be, continue to be interested in how people are commemorating these events 500 years later, primarily in Mexico, but here as well in the US, and just thinking about things like mestizaje and how that's framed differently. So for instance, on the right, you see Gonzalo Guerrero, the maroon Spaniard on the Yucatan, who married a Maya woman and essentially became culturally Maya and did not want to join the Cortés expedition, and he remained behind in Yucatan, as seen as sort of the first instance of Mesoamerican mestizaje, versus, of course, the much more fraught pairing of Cortés and Malinche, and that this monument to the mestizaje in Coyoacan. Don Martin, their child, that statue was stolen in an act of protest. So thinking about the memorialization in monuments, and finally ending with the cover of the book again, and in Tlaxcala, the difference in how Xicontecatl the Elder, the person who helped forge this alliance with the Cortés, is depicted, versus his son Xicontecatl the Younger, who didn't want to make the alliance, and Cortés eventually had executed. His statue is the one that stands in the center of Tlaxcala city, and so it is somewhat of a commentary on how these complex intersections of identity, past and present, can manifest today, and that people can draw on this history in different ways in framing their present realities. So thank you. I will stop right there. I see that there's some questions in the chat that I would be very happy to get to.
Wonderful, David. Thank you so much for this longue durée history. And I feel like there's such richness in this project that everybody should buy the book and read it, because we've only been able to scratch the surface of it here in this talk. I really love hearing about Europe described in the same kind of anthropological terms that we often use for the Americas. And then thinking about these really long histories of colonizations on both sides of the Atlantic that converge in this moment with all of these ramifications. So thank you so much for giving us so much to think about. You can see there are a number of questions in the chat already. Please feel free to upvote questions that you'd like to see answered. Please also keep on submitting your own questions. And then let's just get on to it. David, do you want to take the first question, or
sure,
do you want me to choose some for you?
Yeah, I just opened the Q&A. So I'm seeing this one on how much Aztec cruelty was Spanish invention, and how much truth was there to it. Was there a combination of both? I think yes, you could say that there's both. The Aztec Empire was an expansionistic and militaristic state. There was human sacrifice. There was the display of the body in different ways that are incongruent with norms of Europe at the time. Though I also always like to point out that to understand something as complex as human sacrifice, we need to understand the total context of, especially here, of warfare. And Mesoamerican warfare was very different. I mentioned, the total war of Eurasian civilizations for millennia, versus what had arisen in the Americas in particular, where there was no cavalry, there's no iron weapons. Only in the Andes was there, in West Mexico were there bronze weapons. There's no large fortified defensible cities. the dynamics of warfare was quite different, and the incentive structure related to it was very different. So for a Mexica warrior, you only rose in rank by taking captives in battle, and not by killing them on the battlefield. And so Mexica warriors would purposefully try to land blows with their obsidian swords, the maquawit, below the waist on legs, to then be able to maim a captive and then bring them back to the temple to sacrifice to the gods as part of a religious system. And so, in terms of casualties, the numbers are the same or maybe lower for the Mexica, but it was done very differently in this this very symbolic, this mode of a very symbolic violence, which was seen as outside of the lines of appropriate killing or presentation of the body to Europeans. And so they exaggerated this. They drew on it as part of their justification for why autonomous people should be colonized. And so let's see. I think I mostly answered that one. Let me know if there's more there.
Shall I read out the next question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so this is from Rohan. Thank you for an enlightening talk. Could you expand on your specific use of deep history? What is the difference between deep history and regular history? Or more specifically, between deep history and the longue durée?
That's a great question. And mostly deep history is very much like the longue durée, but I'm trying to use English terms and ones that I'm very familiar with as an archaeologist. And so we think in archaeology of the deeper one digs stratigraphically, the longer the duration of that history. And so we're uncovering history by going downward into the ground, into physical space. And so what it's not is a deep reading of history. So sometimes, so humanists might use that term of, a close reading or deep reading. Of course, that's important. Whenever we engage text, we should be doing close reading and deep reading, but it is really more about the long sort of patterns of culture. And so Brauddel's term is pretty apt there. Other people use terms like, it's a little catchy in some circles to use big history, which is supposed to be like everything from the Big Bang up to present, I suppose. And those undertakings I sometimes engage with. I like the trying to consider the really big existential questions of how humans fit in time. But I at least set out in this particular project that I'm taking a more intermediate angle there, that where I'm only looking at two large regions of the world for a few millennia, to be able to understand these events of really only about 2 years or 3 years, that have received so much attention, but with most of the focus being textual and mostly on that particular interval. And so for a deep historical perspective, I'd say it's looking at those antecedents, saying, okay, what was salient at the time of 1519 to 1521 to explaining that story, and then how did we get there? And take any one of those threads and just follow it back. And it, of course, it's not unchanging, but the fact that there are adelantados and encomiendas in the medieval period, and particular ways of thinking about imperialism to the Roman period, or also, and importantly, that that the Mexica and Tlaxcalteca were doing the same, that they also were drawing linkages to the previous glories of Teotihuacan and other places in framing this encounter. And they of course had different expectations. One thing I didn't really mention in this talk much, and it comes out of a lot of the work of Matthew Restall and others of Lockhart's students, is micro-patriotism. So how did you get, so the fact that Mesoamericans mostly affiliated with their ethnic city-state rather than some sort of corporate understanding of indigeneity. So how did that arise, and how important was that in the way that alliances and battles unfolded?
I've got to say, one of the other terms that's really stuck with me from your talk today is this idea of palimpsest history, and of these sort of much longer histories that you can see embedded in a particular moment. We've got a couple more methodological questions coming up. The next one is from Paulina. Having such an ample experience dealing with both textual and material sources of the period, how limited would you say the former, that is, the textual sources, are in comparison to the material ones? At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned how the rich early colonial periods reach a sort of dead end when attempting to go deep into the history and nuances of this period. And so this is why it's important to look at the material register. In your opinion, to what extent is this an intrinsic condition of sources mediated by the Spaniards? Or is it a limitation of the questions we've asked with these sources and the methodologies we've approached them with?
That's a great question. There's a lot there. So let me try to unpack the beginning part first. So I do go into some detail about thinking about the epistemologies and what author biases are. Of course, it's it's first, people who are unfamiliar with this story might intuit that Cortez's letters come with a certain bias, or any conquistador is going to bring their biases of trying to justify their actions in conquest. A lot of the accounts, of course, came, other conquistadors began writing after 1542, which is when Spain passed these new laws that basically were threatening their land holdings, their encomiendas. And so then they were motivated to write and say, what we did was virtuous, and the Mexica were barbaric and sacrificing people. And likewise with the friars, although the friars, you see, they're much more sympathetic. They had this humanistic training, and in many ways they appreciated culture. They could appreciate daily life and elements where they saw beauty in rhetoric and poetry in particular, was held in esteem. But they also wanted to justify their conversion, their forced conversion of indigenous peoples, and so they brought that bias. But then it might be less intuitive that native peoples had their own forms of bias too when they were writing, but a lot of that has to do with this micro-patriotism. So the Tlaxcaltecas were writing about Tlaxcala, and Alva Ixtlilxochitl, who was a descendant of the ruling lineage of Texcoco, he's trying to frame his ancestors as having acted virtuously throughout these events. So there's other ways, and even a great example comes from Florentine Codex Book 12, where because there were no Tenochca Mexica authors involved in that process with Sahagún. There were some Mexica, but they were from Tlatelolco, and even though they were on the same island and both ethnically Mexica, the Tlatelolca still had this alliance to their own Altepetl that had been annexed by the bigger city on the same island. And so when they recount things like the death of Moctezuma, they say that when basically Moctezuma was a bad emperor and he was cowardly and didn't represent his people well. When they burned his body, it sent off this nasty stench. But at the same time, their own leader, when he was cremated, there was none of that. He was a virtuous leader. So you get these very fascinating indigenous biases too, that unless you're familiar with the particular history of these Altepetl, you might not notice. But I think you're also asking, Paulina, about how do we reconcile material lines of evidence, meaning physical artifacts and sites, versus the texts. And as an archaeologist, this is something we're always grappling with, especially like working in Teotihuacan, where the record is almost all archaeological and then some iconographic as well. We have and we have some very pictographic writing, but we often turn to later periods, what we know from the Aztec, and then try to see how do these materials work with that. Are they congruent with our understanding of cultural patterns in the 16th century, or do they depart in a significant way? And so in some cases, like with the Cortés boat burning, we can see like clearly by looking at the texts, Cortés himself didn't mention burning boats. None of the eyewitness accounts did. It was introduced in the 16th century, and then it became part of like epic poems of the 18th century. And so that, we can see where the text went astray in that particular case. But we don't always have that. We just have a snapshot from certain texts and then just want to query the material remains and say, do they match up or not? And in some cases, we probably will never resolve it, or we can be optimistic and hope that new methods of materials analysis could fill in gaps that we currently have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to go ahead and ask, this may be our last question, one of these terrible contrafactuals, which is from Peyron. In hindsight, would it have been possible for Cortés to accomplish what he did if it weren't for the fraught political tensions between various Aztec factions?
That's another one of those difficult what if questions. And I think the short answer is no, it would never have happened this quickly. But would waves of Spaniards and other Europeans just continually come to to seek gold extraction or settler colonialism? And there, I think, yes. Though, and so here, I think where the more important variable is the death toll from disease. And so that, the first real pandemic struck the Aztec core in 1520 at the interval when, the Spanish had been expelled from Tenochtitlan and were coming back to Tlaxcala. A new boat led by a captain named Narvaez was sent by Velázquez to bring Cortés back, and it's believed that on that boat there was the first individual potentially with smallpox or some other pathogens that were introduced into the Americas. And then we have eyewitness accounts from that period talking about the death toll that was occurring in 1520. And it included, so after Moctezuma died, his successor, Cuitláhuac, only lasted, a couple months, and then succumbed to probably smallpox or some other disease of that pandemic. And so there was just turnover and chaos introduced by disease then. And so I think that's the more important variable. To a lesser degree, maybe differential technologies, I don't think that would have played the same role if it weren't for disease, because I feel like the Mesoamericans would have adapted. And so we might be dealing with a colonial pattern that looked a little more like South Asia, maybe, or parts of East Asia than occurred in the Americas in general. But that's really just because of the huge death toll by introduced diseases.
And I find it really, striking that at least some of the accounts say that it is an enslaved African man who's infected with smallpox on that first boat that comes in. And so once again, that gets us into these entangled histories that we can't think about the sort of demographic collapse in the New World without thinking about the old world histories of slavery.
Right. Yeah. Another fascinating one for me that I've been trying to see if any paleopathologists are working on this. If you know of any, please. I'm very interested in the differential tolls by mosquito-borne illnesses. So there weren't any. So malaria, yellow fever, that those didn't exist in the Americas, and that might explain some of the differences that we see in demographic history of tropical lowland environments versus highland environments. So areas that were more malarial zones, which include the Maya lowlands, the Amazon, other parts of Central America, might have been, impacted at a higher level than some of the semi-arid areas.
Oh, super interesting. We are at time. There are dozens more questions, which I will forward on to you after this talk, but so that people have time to, say, drink a glass of water before their next Zoom meeting. I'm going to wrap up now and say thank you so much for this wonderful book and this enlightening talk today, and all of these questions that open up still more perspectives about methodology and discoveries and understanding still to be achieved. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Claudia, and thanks to all who attended and asked fantastic questions.